The insistent chirping of a smoke alarm pierced through the haze of Daniel's hangover. He lay sprawled on the couch, a discarded bottle of whiskey on the floor, a testament to the previous night's indulgence. His head throbbed in time with the insistent beeping. A wave of nausea washed over him. Ugh! He groaned, pushing himself up. His vision swam. He reached for a cigarette on the coffee table, his hand shaking. Daniel lit the cigarette, inhaling deeply. The nicotine hit his system, providing a momentary reprieve from the pounding in his head. He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling upwards towards the stained ceiling. He looked around the room, taking in the disarray of empty bottles and overflowing ashtrays. A wave of self-loathing washed over him. Another day in paradise. Another groan escaped his lips as he hauled himself to his feet. The room spun momentarily and he gripped the back of the couch for support. He stumbled towards the kitchen, desperate for a strong cup of coffee and a distraction from the echoing emptiness of his apartment. Plato, his faithful husky, stirred from his spot by the door, his tail thumping a slow, steady beat against the floor. He looked up at Daniel with soulful eyes, his tail wagging hopefully. "Morning, boy. Let's get you some breakfast too." He poured himself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the air. As he took a sip, he felt a small semblance of normalcy return. He gazed out of the window, the city slowly coming to life outside. With a sigh, he reached down to pet Plato, finding a brief moment of solace in the simple act. The smell of frying bacon filled the air, doing little to settle Daniel's stomach. He stood over the stove, his movements mechanical as he cooked. Suddenly, the sizzling of bacon morphed into the crackling of a fire. The aroma of breakfast was replaced by the acrid scent of smoke. He was no longer in his kitchen. He found himself in the woods, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. A fire raged in front of him, its flames reaching towards the twilight sky. He could feel the heat on his face. He could taste the fear in his mouth. No, no, no! A scream tore from his throat, raw and primal. He was on his knees, hands covered in blood, his voice hoarse from screaming. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He could feel the blood drying on his face, a macabre mask of guilt and terror. Then, as quickly as it began, the vision vanished. Daniel stood in his kitchen, the smell of burning bacon jolting him back to reality. He gasped, his heart still pounding from the memory. He turned off the stove, his hands trembling. The bacon was ruined, but he didn't care. All he could see was the fire. All he could feel was the blood on his hands. Time seemed to stand still, the ticking of the clock echoing in his ears. The haunting memory lingered, refusing to fade away. The hot water of the shower did little to wash away the lingering chill that clung to Daniel's skin. He stood under the spray, letting the water cascade over him, trying to wash away the remnants of the nightmare and the previous night's excesses. His reflections stared back at him, a stranger with bloodshot eyes and a haunted expression. He reached for the soap, his hand moving across the tiled wall. His fingers brushed against something. It felt cold, slick, and terrifyingly real. His heart leaped into his throat. What the... He snatched his hand back as if burned, his eyes widening in horror. There on the shower door were handprints, bloody handprints. They dripped down the glass, leaving crimson trails in their wake. The sight sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. He staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. He knew those handprints. They were his. Daniel stumbled out of the shower, grabbing a towel and frantically drying himself. He didn't look back at the door, afraid of what he might see. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. Were the handprints a figment of his guilt-ridden imagination, or were they a chilling reminder of a past he couldn't escape? Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, trying to piece together the fragments of his sanity. His hands trembled, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. The clock showed the early morning hours, but sleep was a distant memory. He stared out the window, the darkness outside mirroring the turmoil within. Get a grip, Daniel. It's just your reflection. The bathroom mirror reflected a ghost of a man. Daniel stared at his reflection, his face pale and drawn. He ran a hand through his wet hair, trying to tame the unruly strands. The face in the mirror mimicked his movements, its eyes never leaving his. He splashed water on his face, trying to wash away the lingering fear and the remnants of the nightmare. But the face in the mirror remained, its gaze unwavering. Daniel could feel a cold dread creeping up his spine. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. He knew it was just his reflection. His mind was playing tricks on him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone or something was standing behind him. He quickly glanced over his shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest. The bathroom was empty. Daniel let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned back to the mirror, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The eyes in the mirror seemed to follow his every move, filled with an unnerving intensity. He gripped the sink tightly, trying to steady himself, and then the reflection smirked, a chilling, eerie smirk that sent shivers down his spine. Daniel backed away from the mirror, his heart racing, fear gripping him tighter with every step. The crisp morning air did little to alleviate the unease that clung to Daniel like a shroud. It was time for Plato's walk, a visit to the park. He walked briskly, Plato trotting faithfully by his side. The familiar park, usually a source of tranquility, felt oppressive, the trees looming over him like accusing giants. The sunlight filtering through the leaves seemed to mock him with its normalcy. Just a walk, Daniel, just a normal walk. He muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself that the fear was all in his head. But the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, taking on menacing shapes that danced at the edge of his vision. Well, 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 look what the cat dragged in. A voice, sharp and laced with disdain, cut through the relative quiet of the park. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks, his blood turning to ice. He knew that voice. He'd know it anywhere. He turned slowly, dreading what he knew he would see. And there she was, standing in the middle of the path, her arms crossed, her lips curled into a sneer. Rachel! Her mere presence seemed to suck the air out of his lungs. "What do you want, Rachel?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. "You were never good enough, Danny. I hate you, Daniel Delaney. There is a special place in hell for people like you." Her voice dripped with anger and hatred, her eyes cold and unforgiving. Daniel's heart sank. The weight of her words pressed down on him, suffocating. He looked at the ground, feeling the hopelessness wash over him. Taking a deep breath, he tried to gather the courage to respond. He looked up, determination flickering in his eyes, ready to face whatever came next. The key rattled in the lock, a sound that grated on Daniel's already frayed nerves. He pushed open the door to his apartment, his hand still shaking from his encounter with Rachel. How could she have known he would be at the park? Had she been following him? He stepped inside, the familiar scent of his apartment doing little to soothe his unease. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden silence. The quiet was unnerving, amplifying every creak and groan of the old building. He turned and froze, his breath caught in his throat. Sitting on his couch, as if she belonged there, was Rachel. Her presence was both surreal and terrifying. Her legs were crossed, her posture relaxed, a mocking smile playing on her lips. She seemed to be enjoying his discomfort. The sight sent a jolt of terror through him, stopping his heart for a beat. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "How did you get in here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her. She looked so real, so tangible, but that was impossible. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Does it matter? What matters is that I'm here now. Her voice was calm, almost soothing, but it only heightened his fear. She stood up, her movements fluid and graceful. It was as if she was gliding across the floor. "We have a lot to talk about, Daniel." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, thick and suffocating. Daniel stood frozen, his gaze locked on Rachel as she glided closer, her presence both mesmerizing and terrifying. He couldn't believe his eyes, the disbelief etched deeply into his features. He couldn't fathom how she was here in his apartment, as if the years had melted away. Her form was ghostly, a nostalgic echo of the past, her expression tender yet haunting. One moment she stood before him, a vision of ethereal beauty, her eyes a storm of love and accusation. The next she was gone, replaced by the chilling image of her with Todd Sumner, her new boyfriend. The images flickered back and forth, tormenting him, a cruel dance of reality and illusion. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperate to banish the haunting visions. But when he opened them again, she was still there. Her hand reaching out to caress his cheek. Her touch sent shivers down his spine, a cold reminder of the past. He wanted to pull away, to escape the overwhelming tide of desire and dread that threatened to consume him. But he couldn't. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity as he stood there, caught in the ghostly dance. His hand trembled as he reached out, unsure if he was reaching for a memory or a phantom. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she began to fade, leaving behind only a lingering shadow of what once was. Rachel called out, "Hey, Danny!" Daniel, surprised, responded, "Rachel, what are you doing here?" She explained, "I was just in the neighborhood and I wanted to come by and check on you." Daniel made his way through the house, putting up the dog's leash. Daniel asked, "I tried to call you last night, but I guess you were busy." Rachel replied, "I was with Todd and you know he wouldn't like it if he knew I was talking to you." Daniel, frustrated, questioned, "Then why are you here, Rachel? We don't have anything to talk about. You already made your decision." Rachel smiled and walked over to Daniel, getting close. Her image flickered, showing her dead body lying on the floor, then returned to her standing there as she wrapped her arms around him. She whispered, "I missed you, Danny. Nobody takes care of me the way you do." Daniel yelled, "Then why did you leave me and why are you still messing with Todd? I can't believe anything you say." Daniel made his way over to the couch, sat down and lit a cigarette. He began to pour a small cup of bourbon. After drinking it, Rachel came and sat by him, running her fingers through his hair. His hands were shaking. Rachel said, "I am sorry, Daniel. Things are complicated, but you know I have always loved you, and I always will." Daniel replied, "I think it's time for you to go." He tried to get up, but Rachel pushed him back down and got on top of him. She asked, "Is that what you really want, Danny?" Rachel began to kiss his neck, slowly grinding her body against his. Daniel felt the fire ignite, the sparks fly, and he was smitten by her once again. Nothing else mattered. Daniel and Rachel ended up in bed in a fiery crescendo of love and loss. Could this be happening? It was Danny's dream come true. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. They made love, her lips on his hands gripping her thigh with each thrust. Danny was filling the hole in his chest. "This is the love of my life, my everything." After roughly 45 minutes, the two lay next to each other in a cuddled embrace. Rachel said, "Hey, Danny." Daniel asked, "What is it?" Rachel confessed, "I don't want this night to end." Daniel's phone vibrated with a text message notification. He said, "Me either, so what are we going to do about Todd?" Rachel replied, "I'll just tell him it's over." Daniel laughed slightly. "I can't believe this is happening, but what made you change your mind?" Rachel reiterated, "Like I said, I missed you, Danny." Daniel checked his phone, and it was a message from Rachel. "Seriously, Danny, 47 missed calls. Stop calling me or I will get a restraining order." Daniel looked back over to see that Rachel was gone. He began to freak out, curling up and crying, then manically screaming. Enraged, he made his way to the couch and poured a drink. He sat there, staring at the empty glass, his mind racing. The room felt colder, the shadows longer. He whispered to himself, was any of it real? He glanced at the clock, realizing how much time had passed. The silence was deafening. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through old messages, trying to find some semblance of reality. The weight of the night pressed down on him, and he felt utterly alone. He whispered, "Rachel, why did you have to come back?" The memories of their time together flooded his mind, each one more painful than the last. He took another sip of bourbon, hoping to drown the sorrow. The night seemed endless, and Daniel was left to grapple with his haunting thoughts. Daniel Delaney woke with a gasp. his body bathed in a cold sweat. He was sprawled on his bed. He remembered Rachel being there. It all felt so real, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to him like cobwebs. His apartment was empty, the silence deafening. Rachel was gone. He stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky, his head pounding. He reached for his phone, his hand trembling as he scrolled through his messages. There at the top of the screen was a message from Rachel. "I mean it, Danny, leave us alone." A wave of nausea washed over him as the full weight of his reality crashed down upon him. Rachel wasn't there. She was with Todd. He had imagined it all. The encounter at the park, her presence in his apartment, the touch of her hand. It was all in his head, a cruel trick of his guilt-ridden mind. Daniel sank to his knees, his phone slipping from his grasp. He was alone, utterly alone. And the worst part of it all was that he couldn't even blame the alcohol anymore. He had crossed a line, a terrifying threshold into madness, and he didn't know how to find his way back. The crushing weight of reality was too much to bear. He clung to the memories, but they offered no solace. The world outside seemed distant, unreachable. Daniel was trapped in his own mind, a prisoner of his own making.